for that. But the problem is, Justice, we already talked about Spider-Man and what we think about it. But now let's talk about the movie itself. I have a problem with this Spider-Man movie, and it's a problem that I've had with this Spider-Man in general. Now, I want you to tell me what you think about that. Obviously, I've been on record of calling this new Spider-Man Iron Boy just because it pisses people off. But being a fan of Spider-Man, one of my two favorite heroes are Batman, Spider-Man, and then after that is the Flash. So, like, being a huge fan of Spider-Man, growing up with the Tobey Maguire movies, and then watching the Andrew Garfield ones begrudgingly, but I still watch them, and then seeing these Spider-Man movies, my big problem is that Spider-Man, it doesn't really feel like he's doing it all on his own. That was kind of the big thing about Spider-Man, was he was this kid in high school that became a superhero and was kind of doing everything on his own. One of the big things with this is to tie him into the MCU. They were like, let's tie him to Iron Man. Let's have Iron Man help him out. Now, obviously, he was doing his thing before Iron Man came to him in Civil War, but now he's been attached at the hip basically with the Iron Man character since then. And my big problem is that this new movie is coming up. And in the last two movies, I cannot tell you that those characters, the bad guys, hated Spider-Man because he was Spider-Man. I felt like they hated Spider-Man because he was in the way, because they hated Iron Man. That was the thing. They hated Iron Man, and Spider-Man was just in the way. And going and watching all of these Spider-Man movies, the best thing for a superhero is, I hate you, whatever your name is, superhero, because you're this superhero and I don't like you. And that's kind of my problem with this new movie, is they're now supposedly, we're going into spoilers here, so if you don't want to hear anything about Spider-Man Far From Home, click off of this video right now. I said Far From Home, No Way Home. If you don't want to know anything about this movie from the leaks that have come out, click off of this video right now. One of the things that has happened is that with the multiverse, there's supposedly going to be Spider-Men in this movie, right? Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire, because confirmed in the movie is Alfred Molina, who played Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2. And Jamie Foxx is apparently going to be in the movie as Electro from the Amazing Spider-Man universe. One of my problems is that I don't think the MCU has properly been able to give Spider-Man his own villains, because nobody just hates him for being Spider-Man. And my problem is that they said, okay, we're going to pull villains from these other successful Spider-Man movies that have been able to make these villains that hate Spider-Man and bring them into our movie, because now we have villains that hate Spider-Man for just being Spider-Man. I feel like it's lazy. I think that it's just lazy writing that, hey, we couldn't find a way to make these villains hate Spider-Man, so now we're going to bring all these villains in from these other successful Spider-Man movies, which I haven't even gotten to the big one. I mean, there's other news. They've said that Willem Dafoe might be in the movie, or is almost confirmed. There have been set photos that were then pulled off the internet saying that Willem Dafoe was going to be in the movie as Norman Osborn. And then they are saying that Thomas Hayden Church would be back as Sandman from Spider-Man 3, and that the Lizard from the Amazing Spider-Man 1 is going to be in the movie as well. And they're going to make their own version of the Sinister Six versus the three Spider-Men. Now, what the hell is the problem, Justice? How do you view them just pulling all these, and obviously maybe I'm just being a little bit too much of a Spider-Man fanboy, but them pulling in these villains that were set up in other Spider-Man franchises to hate Spider-Man, when in their own franchise, they can't set up their own villains that just hate Spider-Man?
Well, I do want to preface this by saying that I grew up a huge fan of the Tobey Maguire movies. I even like Spider-Man 3, which not a lot of
Mm.
people like.
Oh, I
Um,
love Spider-Man 3, but
yeah, I don't understand the hate for it, but teach his own. I did not watch the Andrew Garfield Spider-Mans
mm,
like at all. Haven't even seen clips of them, honestly. Um, but I do love Tom Holland, right?
mm,
Just because I was a kid, I would probably say Tobey Maguire is my personal favorite Spider-Man.
mm,
So although I do think Tom has a lot of potential and I think that he can take it a lot of places, so I'm excited to see what he does with it. Um, for me, it's kind of like what I mentioned earlier about how Feige he to have Spider-Man come into the MCU and just kind of like be a standalone would have been pointless. I
mm,
think that he was like, all right, we don't want to have Spider-Man in the MCU just to have him in the MCU, right? Like we want to have him integrated with everybody else, or I'm sorry, just so that he could eventually turn into an Avenger, right?
yeah,
So I think that that's kind of where they were going with that. They were like, all right, Tony can be his mentor. Tie him to Tony. We know, obviously, at the time they knew Tony was going to die.
mm,
So they were like, he could kind of start as the next, Iron Man kind of
mm,
iconic, superhero type of figure, right? Um, so I think that Marvel wanted to do that. They wanted to have him tied to Marvel in some way rather than just to have Spider-Man in the
mm,
MCU and say it's a Marvel movie. So I don't necessarily hold that against them for right now. I do think that it'll be interesting to see how they manage this whole multiverse
mm,
situation, where you have the three different Spider-Mans and then all the villains come in. I'm kind of anxious to see what they're going to do with that because, to your point, it could be lazy and they could just be like, oh, here's some already well developed Spider-Man villains. Let's
mm,
bring them in and just throw them in a movie, and now we have Spider-Man villains. But um, I honestly, I'll give Kevin Feige the benefit of the doubt because I think he deserves it. I think that Marvel deserves for us to see where they're going with it. I feel like everything up to this point in Marvel has been pretty masterful, especially when you consider all of the like hurdles they had to jump over. Just dealing with Universal with the Hulk and dealing
mm,
with Spider-Man and Sony, having to obviously acquire Fox because there was no way Fox was going to let them use the X-Men without so I think that, and not only that, but to juggle everything, to have Fox properties come over, that's huge.
mm,
Like
mm,
that kind of you now you I know that Marvel, they're very meticulous about their planning and everything else. So for them to have everything so intricately developed and planned out, and then to say, hey, we're going to give you guys the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and Doctor Doom, and everybody else, right? Magneto and Wolverine. Like
mm,
now you have to kind of add these characters in, and you have to have them integrated with the MCU, figure out where you're going to plop them into movies, because we know Marvel loves to kind of give you a tease before they give you the real thing.
mm,
So I can imagine you see a Doctor Doom in like a Black Panther movie. I can imagine you see like a Magneto in something, and then
mm.
that kind of goes into the X-Men, whatever the case may be. So I don't necessarily, I definitely understand what your concerns are as far as it being lazy and kind of just them throwing villains at them. But they I think that they're trying to just kind of come up with a way to make everybody happy. You know what I mean? They're like, okay, we got the three Spider-Mans and the villains. Let's see how the public reacts to this, right? And then I
And
think
yeah.
eventually Spider-Man will develop his own his own like reputation to the point where people hate him instead of just hating
Mhm.
Tony.
Yeah. My my big problem with it is just that they've had 2 movies and they've already done the same shtick twice of having people that didn't like Iron Man for whatever reason, and then Spider-Man is just in the way. So then they're making a third movie, they're making a multiverse movie. This is great, and I'm gonna add a fact in here that I didn't throw in earlier of leaks that have come out. Um, So they're going to have all these villains in it. They're going to do a Spider-Verse movie. Whatever. That's awesome. Into the Spider-Verse was one of my favorite animated movies that I've ever seen. One of the best
Amazing movie.
Spider-Man movies I've ever seen. If they want to take that concept, bring in the Spider-Man that I loved as a kid, and then the Spider-Man that ripped my heart out whenever they replaced the Spider-Man of my childhood in, and then Tom Holland, who I'm still trying to get that kind of affection to, that I like him as much as I did the other Spider-Man. Going into the third movie, them putting all that, like I've said, this is an Avengers Endgame type thing, that if they are going to have all this stuff in this movie, like, you're going to get old fans, new fans, everybody is going to watch this movie. And my only problem is that they're bringing in these villains for this movie, and the supposed ending is that Doctor Strange will get all of them back to their realities, except for Norman Osborn's Green Goblin, which is the big one. That when I see that, I'm like, you couldn't have just made your own Norman Osborn. You had to go into a film franchise, which, by the way, they're pulling these villains out before they die in their said movies, because Norman Osborn is dead at the end of Spider-Man 1. Spoilers for a movie that came out in 2002. But he dies at the end of that movie. And then Doc Ock gets pulled out of the reality before he dies in Spider-Man 2. And then Thomas Hayden Church doesn't die in Spider-Man 3. But in this movie, apparently all of these villains say that Spider-Man has killed them in their realities, which would make no sense if we're going to go based on that. But if it's multiverses and maybe they're from slightly different versions of the universes that the movies that already came out, I can understand that, whatever. But my problem is, okay, they're going to send them all back. It's a one movie thing. It's fan service. I get it. But now they're going to keep Norman Osborn, which is a character they could have easily made by themselves, and they're going to take it from a universe that was already super successful and use that to move forward their universe. I just feel like they could have done it by themselves, and I just want them to develop. Now there's a Norman Osborn that hates Spider-Man because he's Spider-Man, but they didn't develop it. He just hates Spider-Man because he already hated Spider-Man from a different universe. So I just think it's slightly lazy. I wish that they would change it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm going to love it. I'm going to love it. Now, obviously, I'm also going to have my problems with it. Like, I've had problems with every single of the MCU Spider-Man movies. But I still think that there's things they need to improve on. It's just my big problem with this film is I need them to be more original than just being like, okay, we're going to bring in all these villains, and then one's going to escape and he hates Spider-Man, and who knows, maybe that goes on for Spider-Man 4 or whatever they call it. So I don't know. That's just my big problem. Do you have any closing remarks on that before I ask the people what they think?
I'm not gonna lie. I was a fan of the J. Jonah Jameson type of appearance. Coming from obviously I don't know if it was the original Spider-Man movie, but the Tobey Maguire
Yeah.
interpretation. I was a fan. I really do like him. And so I was happy to see him kind of brought into Marvel. However, you did mention, you said Strange would get everybody back to their timeline.
Yes.
So do you think that they'll have the multiverse figured out by that point?
No.
Or so how does that happen?
I think what happens is something, the leaks have said that something happens and these villains get put in from their realities. But just because all of the realities are out of whack does not mean that Doctor Strange cannot send them back to where they came from. It's just kind of like when there's a hole and you plug it and then another hole pops up. That's kind of just what happens. So, okay, they're going to get sent back, but that's not going to be the only problems in the MCU. And so that's what's going to happen there. That's what they say. They also say at the beginning of the movie, he puts them in like a prison. He's getting all these different variants and people that are showing up that aren't supposed to be there and putting them in a prison. Like there's a whole lot of stuff. Strange. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff going on with it. And I think that this movie has the potential to be really, really good. And I think that them using all the villains again is lazy, but if they're going to have a whole plot centered around having the three different Spider-Men in there that have fought it, I understand that. But carrying it on past this movie to when they could have easily developed their own Norman. And you said you liked the J. Jonah Jameson. The thing that I liked about that was it was the same character played by the same actor, but it wasn't the same J. Jonah Jameson
That's
from
very true. That is true.
from that movie. It's technically a different one,
Mhm.
but they did the fan service. So if Willem Dafoe showed up as the Green Goblin and Norman Osborn, but he wasn't from the Tobey Maguire universe, he was just Norman Osborn in name only, I would like that a hell of a lot more than I do them just plucking him from a different universe from a successful Spider-Man and being like, here you go. Now you have Spider-Man's greatest villain now in the MCU. And he,
However, in WandaVision, we did have the Quicksilver
Ralph Boner.
spotting. Right, exactly. So, do you think it could be like maybe a trick, kind of like how that was?
If I get Ralph Bonered in Spider-Man Far From Home, even once, I would I there will be fire.
There will be
So
carnage.
there will be carnage. Let there be carnage. So what does everybody think about that? What do you think about these Spider-Men coming in? And it's going to be a fun time of a movie. What does everybody think about the villains? Do you think it's just okay we're getting the Spider-Man movies? Maybe I'm looking too much into it. Let me know down below in the comments section.